I'm Jillian Báez. I'm an associate professor over in Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino studies. I'm trained as a communication scholar, just as way of kind of discipline and background. And what I want to talk about today is actually a less formal assignment that I do. It's part of participation. It's low stakes, and I've had to rethink it several times. So just by way of background, once upon a time before the pandemic, when I only taught in person, one of the activities that I would have students do before we started discussion is I would have them do something called quick writes. Some of you may be familiar with this, where you put up a prompt or you read a prompt to the students. It could be a question, it could be maybe a quote from some assigned reading that you did, and you put on a timer for 5 to 10 minutes, and the students just put pen to paper and do some free writing in response. The advantages of this were that the students got to think before we participated in discussions. So especially for students who, I would say two kinds of students, either students who had a very emotional response. I think writing forces them to sort of sort that out before they engage in the discussion with other students. But also too, I think for my very introverted students, this gave them an opportunity to get something on paper. And I would even allow some of the most shy students, if they wanted to read part of it, instead of just talking, off the cuff, they were able to do that. But I want to point out that one of the downsides was I always felt like this particular activity in class was not great for my students with certain learning disabilities, meaning like it didn't really fit within universal design, because I had the timer going on, and I would take no more than 10 minutes, just because it was a shorter part of class, and I wanted to make sure that we got to the larger discussion and other material we might be working on that day together. So I say this to you with the caveat that when we moved online, and I had to rethink what this would look like. And initially, my first response was like, I think so many of us, which is like, I will just move this to the discussion board, right? Like I'll post a question there, a prompt, and the students will just respond to it, which was not terrible most of the time. And students, I will say this, right? The positive of discussion boards is that students tend to know how to use it. It tends to have the least amount of glitches, in my opinion. I do use other tools like Hypothesis, for example, as Jeff does, which is really exciting, but it also means Hypothesis has to work that day. And so versus the discussion board is a little bit more stable. However, the problem that I ran into across a number of my courses is when we were dealing with more controversial topics, or even topics where students just hadn't really thought about that particular issue or question, to be honest, because I think sometimes we assume they have strong viewpoints, and sometimes that's true. And then sometimes it's also the case that they just haven't thought about something, and so they don't have a very well-formed position on it. I began to realize that the discussion board took away from the privacy and the introspection that some of them needed, that they were getting from those original quick writes, which they were doing by themselves, right? And they could share whatever they wanted on there, but they could also choose not to share parts or all of it. And so what I ended up doing, and I'm going to share my screen in just a second, is I began to think about how could I translate that quick write into a more private assignment, where they had the time to, and where they also had all the time that they needed to write, right? In order to make it a little bit more accessible for my students with certain kinds of learning disabilities, or to be honest, just for my slower writers. I happen to be a slower writer too, so I could appreciate, or to be honest with you, in class, they were writing mostly by hand. And let's be honest, handwriting is not necessarily all of our students' forte, for a number of different reasons at this point in time, right? Most of them can keyboard much quicker than they can actually handwrite. But all of this is to say, what I decided to do was I took there is a 100 level course that I teach called Language and Ethnic Identity. It is a general education course. So it's a very heterogeneous class always, meaning that I have students who run the gamut from being first year freshmen to those who have just transferred to us from community colleges who technically come in, you know, as lower level sophomores or upper level or somewhere along the scale in terms of being juniors. And then I have a few seniors, you know, like Jennifer and Sarah, who are just like trying to get those 3 credits in, and this looked like an interesting course. And so here they are, and they don't really necessarily know what it's about, but here they are. Most of them have no background in the area, so I don't get a lot of communication students or students who are studying linguistics. They come from all sorts of majors across the natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities. So what I'm getting at is it's a really mixed group. And I never really know what we're going to talk about because they're just bringing so much to the table. So what I decided to do this time around, this semester, I'm teaching this course hybrid. So, you know, I went from in-person to fully online to being in person, and had to really give some thought to what this would look like within this setting, and being mindful about that I wanted the students to both have an opportunity to be able to think and write, but also be able to have kind of a private space where they could think about these issues before we jumped into them. And I will say this, I am not doing this every week. So what I decided was to use the what I think of as old school journal function on Blackboard. That's one of the earliest tools that I ever implemented on Blackboard, and kind of did away with it. Partly because I don't teach a lot of 100 level courses where I ask the students to do a lot of reflection. And I find that the journals, that's what they're for. But I realized that this could be a really, you know, a good transition in terms of making the quick writes more asynchronous, right? And that this could work both in teaching this course fully online, but also too, if I taught it hybrid or even in person, you could give this to them as an assignment. So I'm pulling up like what the students did for this past week. My prompts are not always this text heavy, but I will say this, if your prompts are more text heavy, it's better to do it this way than to do it in class, where they're trying to read on the screen or going through the paper with you, and they just have time to process it. And this particular prompt I had them do because I felt that this was going to be a little bit more controversial, not just politically, but also too, I had gotten to know my students a little bit and realized that most of them had received some form of bilingual education, but hadn't really processed what that meant for them. And for some of them, that was a good experience. For some of them, it sounded a little bit more traumatizing. And for some of them, they really didn't know how to make sense of it. They really hadn't thought about it until they came to this course. So I wanted them to have a space to be able to process this without talking to each other. I made it clear that this was private, but that I read it, of course, right? That I take a look at it. It's low stakes, so it just counts towards their participation. They get a check or no check. No check is if you don't do it. And what I had them do was they did watch a documentary on their own. This was something that they could stream at home on Canopy just to be able to save time in class. And thank you so much to our librarians for keeping Canopy. It's very useful. And I pulled 2 quotes from that particular documentary and asked them to reflect on those 2 quotes, which really kind of present very different kinds of perspectives on bilingual education. I also think this is a good alternative for debates. I used to do debates in my classrooms too. I don't do that anymore. Since 2016, and given also to our student population, I think that unless you're dealing with issues that you don't feel like our particular student population will feel strongly about, I think it can end up being a disaster. And so this was also like a way for me to get them to think about like, where do you stand on this right now? And I also make it clear to them too, that sometimes they may not know where they stand, or that may shift over time, especially if they've never thought about like the particular issue we're talking about. And so I think it's you know, it's become like a useful tool for being able to get them to think a little bit and be introspective and have the space and the time to do that. And then what happens after this is then I bring a several set of related discussion questions to class, and then we discuss. And by then I think it works a little bit better because the students have had time to process and they have more to say in class, to be honest with you. So it's just a more generative discussion, and they oftentimes bring more questions to class. And they're not caught off guard, if you will. when you just kind of throw those questions out there and ask them to just respond. I will say too, this is also, I think, really good for thinking about, I'm thinking about the teaching learning circle that I've been co-facilitating with my colleague Vicki Lenz over in social work. These are the kinds of questions we often think about. So by the way, if this is something you're interested in, you're more than welcome to join us. We had our first session, but folks can join us later on in the other sessions as well. But we're always thinking through sort of these questions about like, how do we, how do we generate like really inclusive discussions in the classroom? How do we help students to feel more comfortable contributing? But also too, how do we really get them to, think through their ideas, be critical thinkers, and be able to express those ideas in multiple ways, right? Through, and oftentimes through discussion, we tend to think of that only as the spoken word verbally. But there's also a written component of that, and this helps to kind of bridge going back and forth between verbal and written communication.